Welcome to episode 10 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the novel Quartet in Autumn by Barbara Pym. Welcome to The Reading Cure, where great books and great ideas are what we like to prescribe. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Barbara Pym was an English novelist who enjoyed two distinct periods of success in her literary career. In the 1950s, she wrote a series of social comedies, including Excellent Women, Jane and Prudence, and Less Than Angels, which attracted considerable critical acclaim, including from the poet Philip Larkin, who became a lifelong champion of Pym's work. Her novels often featured church-going, rural communities, and anthropologists, the latter being no doubt inspired by Pym's 30-plus years working as an assistant editor for the scholarly journal Africa at the International African Institute in London. Pym's fifth novel, A Glass of Blessings, received poorer critical reviews, and come the early 1960s, both her sales and relations with her publisher were in decline. This marked the onset of what has been termed Pym's wilderness years, as she published nothing at all between 1962 and 1977. Then, in January of the latter year, the Times Literary Supplement published an article about the most underrated English novelists of the century, and two of the contributors to that article, one being Philip Larkin, highlighted Pym as having been hugely underappreciated. This sparked a renewed interest in her work from publishers, and later that year, the landmark novel, which we'll be discussing today, A Quartet in Autumn, was published, going on to receive a nomination for the Booker Prize that year. Barbara Pym would only live another 3 years after this. She died of breast cancer in 1980, and thus only experienced the early years of her literary revival and renewed appreciation by critics and the wider reading public. Pym never married, despite having a number of relationships throughout her life, and lived with her sister Hilary in her final years. Hilary and others would go on to champion Pym's work after her death, helping to establish her reputation as one of the great English novelists of the 20th century. Coming then to this novel, Quartet in Autumn, this poignant tragicomedy tells the story of four London office mates in the 1970s, Letty, Marcia, Norman and Edwin, who are all approaching retirement. All are bereft of partners, have little in the way of close family, and few social contacts outside of their work. Letty's retirement plan is to move it to a house in the countryside with her friend Marjorie, but this is scuppered when the latter becomes engaged to a local minister. Whereas for the withdrawn Marcia, retirement allows her to retreat entirely into her own world of categorising her strange collection of tins, milk bottles and plastic bags, which she pursues obsessively in the grand but dilapidated home that was formerly her mother's. As time goes on, Marcia becomes increasingly alienated from social life and indeed reality itself, and stops eating properly despite having recently been operated on for a breast tumour. With the retirement of the two women, Norman and Edwin equivocate about how much to keep in touch with them, eventually leading Edwin to do a belated check-in on Marcia. He finds her emaciated and close to death, and she passes away shortly after in hospital. This tragedy, however, leads Edwin, Norman and Letty to rally together again for her funeral, with the hard-up Norman ultimately learning that Marcia has left him her house. Letty comes to see more hope for finding some fulfilment in her retirement, which may well involve a more attentive friendship with Norman and Edwin. Now, just before we begin our discussion of today's featured book, I just wanted to remind you that there are a number of things you can do to help support the podcast if you have been enjoying The Reading Cure. You can hit subscribe on YouTube or on podcast apps. You can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And lastly, we have a Patreon page as well if you'd be interested in supporting us there. You can find links to all of these on our webpage, which is thereadingcure.com. And thank you to those who are already supporting the podcast in various ways. That support is hugely appreciated. So, first question then, Alec. In this novel, Quartet in Autumn, do you think, is it mainly social convention that leads the characters to keep their distance from each other? Or do you think that Pym is really writing about something more innately antisocial that's within all of us.
Yeah, well, my initial answer to that is that there would be a contextual element to it, in as far as these were four rather different people being forced to share an office. And in that context, it was difficult for them to be that open with each other. They were also leading rather reclusive lives out with the office. So I think that's why they could kind of come across as wary about how much they open up, because it is a work environment, and quite an intimate one, in the sense of four people within one office, and yet they keep their distance there. So I do think there was the contextual element, but there could be a more wide-ranging element. And because if you think about what it is to have a self, as we ordinarily view it, a self, we have a public-facing self, our persona, and then we have a more private self, which we may share and ordinarily do, at least with a few intimate others. But that sort of difference between the public and private self means that practically all of us are hiding something from the wider world. We all have our secrets or things that we don't want to disclose, and that can vary in extent. There might be some things that we haven't shared with anyone, and so there is that thing about the nature of a private self that suggests that, you know, human beings don't disclose everything, that they hold back from others, particularly others that are work colleagues, as these four were. I mean, they weren't only work colleagues. Part of the subtlety of this novel is that while they were work colleagues on paper and they weren't quite intimates, they were in this kind of liminal zone between colleagues and friends. They were the only community that they really had, the four of them. They were the only real friends that they had, even if they fell short of being friends. So yeah, I think that it is part of our nature to hold back. Maybe not to be antisocial necessarily, but not to be too open. We all feel like being closed to some extent. We don't want to be open books completely.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think so. I mean, it is. I think in terms of the idea about how much is it convention, or is it antisocial, or indeed, as you say, maybe more just a kind of guardedness, that, you know, the public face idea. I think it is some combination of the two. I mean, it struck me, it was, you know, there's an interesting scene early on where one of the women in the office, Letty, goes to this restaurant for lunch called the Rendezvous, but the way it's depicted, you know, it's full of people who go there alone, you know, and it's all, and it talks about office workers who just come in and shovel some food in their mouth quickly and leave, you know, and there's a point where somebody at our table maybe looks up to, maybe, you know, they're not coming together, but this woman maybe is going to make a comment about the menu and Letty doesn't take her on, and it does kind of, depict a kind of working world where there are kind of conventional channels that people are operating on in terms of how far they go socially. I think that's true, though. Also, an important the idea about the kind of, you mentioned the liminal idea of this, you know, the space they're in, because you know, they have interesting conversations together in the office, sometimes about, you know, random things. You know, sometimes they're talking about getting older and about death and about, you know, and then they'll talk about their holidays, and, you know, there's a kind of mixture of the maybe the more conventional public stuff, but maybe occasionally a bit more of openness about themselves. They certainly know the details of each other's lives, and the fact that they are all quite lonely and quite isolated. They're aware of that. So yeah, they're in a kind of funny place, I think, and I think that's what they're grappling with really in this book, isn't it? That they you know, whether to become friends or not, or quite how that could even work given what they're all like. You know, it's a sort of uneasy transition that they're not quite sure they want to make, actually, as the, you know, the kind of retirement of Letty and Marcia looms. So yeah, I think there is both, isn't there? I think there's certainly,
well, there is, and I remember reading a book by a philosopher, I can't recall his name, but it was called Awkwardness, and it was about the nature of awkwardness, and he he said that awkwardness is where social norms break down, or they can't really encapsulate a given situation, and therefore it's awkward. And there is an awkwardness to some extent with the characters in this office. They're very familiar with each other in a sense because they see each other day in, day out, 5 days a week. But there is a kind of awkwardness or hesitancy about how far they should, be, how much they should become friends, how much they should open up. As you say, they do open up about certain things, but they don't go too far. They don't. Yes. It doesn't go into the realm of friendship quite. And that's because I think they're existing in this awkward zone of, being very familiar with each other in one sense, but in another sense, not really knowing each other too well and being rather different people. And there isn't really a social role that encapsulates that liminal realm, between work colleague and friend. You could say associate, maybe, acquaintance, but it's really hard to define what they are to each other. It's not quite workmate just, and it's not quite friend either.
It's quite a strange one, really, because I mean, for example, it's there's almost like a sort of married couple familiarity. There's one point I think where Letty Cooking's mentioned, and it says she knows that inevitably Norman is now going to describe how he likes to fry everything, and he makes bad omelets. It's like that sort of kitchen sink familiarity. So they have that, but it's like in a way they know each other too well. They've had so much of the kind of concrete humdrum of each other that they don't really find each other a very exciting prospect, actually, socially in some ways, and also they are different. So there's a kind of strange mixture of intimacy and distance, actually, like if it's maybe antisocial isn't quite the word, but there's a sort of unwillingness actually to get too involved with each other, maybe partly because they do know each other in some ways quite well and are not that interested.
Well, I think that's a very good point, that they do know each other very well in terms of certain details of their lives, their home lives, even though they've never visited each other's homes until later on in the novel with the tragic circumstances. But in one sense, you could see them, or certainly Norman and Marcy, as a kind of couple, but a kind of couple that have got well past the honeymoon stage, and they know each other, what they're going to say, what they think, but it is rather wearying and unedifying.
Yes, I think so. I mean, there's a quote actually about because it's intimated at various points. Marcia and Norman, two of the had a faint sense of attraction, and it says a faint stirring of interest, many degrees cooler than tenderness. This is about it. It's so lukewarm. It doesn't actually inspire any particular action. It's kind of lingering, but I mean, it then describes that Marcia, she has this operation because I think she has a breast cancer, and then she becomes infatuated with the doctor, it's a kind of fantasy. She knows she'll never be with him or anything like that, but she becomes sort of fascinated on his well-to-do life, and she imagines his family home, and it describes that as being kind of, she loses all interest in Norman, who understandably seems a lot less exciting in comparison than Dr. Strong,
when we look at Norman, we're looking at an ineffectual man in many ways. He is a sort of frustration is the main emotion that he feels. Frustration that comes from a sense of ineffectuality, a sense of powerlessness. Whereas Mr. Strong, as the name suggests, is someone of status, of potency, of consequence, very different to Norman. Of course, as you say, there's no way that the eccentric Marcia, working in an office, would ever really find herself within the orbit of Mr. Strong if she wasn't a patient, that is. Exactly. So yes, while Marcia has turned her head in her fantasy to Mr. Strong, it's the Normans of this world that she would that would be possible dating partners, and you could see from both sides why that doesn't really happen. It's not very tempting, isn't it? Really.
Well, exactly. That's it. I mean, you've got Norman who harps on about prices. Edwin, only really seems to be interested in churches, and church life, and then Marcia, that she collects these tins, and that they have these kind of obsessive hobbies, tendencies that they've become lost in, and it really hasn't made them very appealing company. Actually, they've kind of slightly failed to really cultivate a great roundedness to their characters, unfortunately.
Yes, this ties in with what you were saying is antisocial behaviour, because I think there's 2 points that could be made here. One of them is, as you say, all of these characters, maybe Letty less so, to be fair, are at least 3 of them are deeply entrenched in a certain perspective. With Marcy, it's particularly obvious what that one is: her hoarding, her obsessions. But the 3 of them are very much operating within a fixed perspective, which means that if you didn't share that perspective, they couldn't really be reached. They're somewhat alienated by how deeply entrenched their perspective is. It isn't too open to life, and it isn't too varied, as you say. With Edwin, it's church going primarily. With Marcy, it's collecting milk bottles and things like that, which is a very impoverished and unfulfilling pursuit. But the pursuits are quite narrow, and the chances of commonality are slim. And even if they are shared to a point, there is a sort of sense of dampening decorum that holds people back. And this kind of leads on to another point I want to make, is that I think another reason why the characters are a little bit wary of getting too close to each other is that they're not really sure how committed they should be to each other's welfare. And so they recognise a certain moral imperative, or at least a moral consideration for each other, but they are ambivalent about it. You see that on a repeated basis with the characters, particularly centering around Marcia, that they're aware that they could be doing a bit more, looking out for her, but they hold back. And that's another reason why I think that they don't want to be too close, because closeness comes with commitment, and even church-going Edwin is wary about that commitment.
Without doubt. I mean, I think that's absolutely key, that point there, Alec. And I thought was quite ingenious, really, about Barbara Pym's writing, is that she kind of, you do see social convention, but actually it's like the characters themselves, maybe for their slightly more antisocial or just ambivalent mindsets, are using social convention as an excuse, actually, at times. They're thinking, oh, well, maybe the social workers involved
exactly.
in Marcy are, it's definitely been used as a kind of sometimes public justification to each other or justification to themselves, because it's not just to kind of chastise them for that, because obviously, the social worker that does visit Marcia, she's a very difficult person. She doesn't really want her there, and she just rejects this kind of reaching out. So they're not really quite sure what to do, and they're not very motivated to do that much either, unfortunately.
No. But I think that's a very good point that you made, that I would say they weaponize that social convention, because one of the critiques in this novel is that concern is becoming something the state deals in. So in reality, the people that could show a more authentic concern for Marcy are the 3 co-office workers, not the social worker, because while the social worker doesn't sound great, she doesn't sound as though she's that empathic. I think that Pym is trying to convey, though, that there's no way that this young social worker could have authentic concern, like the office workers, like the Edwins and Normans and Letties that are around Marcy, the closest that Marcy has to friends. You know, I'm not saying necessarily that meant that they had to look after Marcy like a relative necessarily, but you can't magic up that concern, and it getting handed over to the authorities, to the state. It actually allows people like Edwin to step back from helping Marcy, because, you know, he's relieved to hear that the state looks after pensioners, old folk, because it means he doesn't have to do it. And this is something that we also see in the modern world with therapy, in that I think that unfortunately there will be some people that think, right, okay, my partner is depressed and such, I'll just hand them over to a therapist to deal with it. I'm not saying that's wrong, because obviously they can get help through therapy, but it does mean potentially that people in their actual lives end up doing less.
I think so. I think you're right. I mean, I think that there's definitely a strong moral critique running through the novel about people shunning responsibility for each other.
Exactly.
It's not to say, I mean, again, and I think it's really well done, because in the case of Marcia, I mean, it's very clear that there's almost at some point, every character that considers her takes a kind of solace in thinking of somebody else that might be solving the problem.
Yeah.
You know, our doctor thinks that way. The social worker thinks that about, oh, that's good, there was some office mate coming to visit, that's great. You know, they're all kind of a bit baffled and a bit stumped, but at the same time, in the case of those that are the as close as she's got to friends, and she doesn't seem to have any family, they really are the ones that know her, that could make a bit of an impact. And yeah, they don't do enough. I mean, they have the lunch, don't they, Norman and Edwin, after quite a bit after both the women have retired, and you know, they kind of, you know, they do it and they go through it, but they're kind of very explicit about the fact it's a duty and they're glad to have gotten it out of the way. You know, they don't really want to, and you know, even the sort of responsibility they do kind of allow themselves to feel only goes so far, you know. So they do,
yeah. And I do think that's one of the main critiques, isn't it, about people passing on responsibility. Of course, Pym is aware, as we are reading the novel, that Marcy is not an easy person to deal with, and she is the ultimate hot potato. People are passing her on to other people. But I do think that she's nevertheless saying that Letty, Norman and Edwin perhaps could have done a little bit more for her. And the irony is that they recognise that and do more for her after she's died.
This kind of leads quite nicely into the second question, because you know, the issue of what makes her such a hot potato. What the question was, what do you think are the main psychological blind spots of each character that has maybe led to their own particular mode of self-defeating behaviour?
Yeah, well, I'll start with Norman. Norman is the cynic, the pessimist. So he is somewhat embroiled or kept within that limited perspective. Because he is pessimistic, he's cynical, it actually blinds him to possibilities in other people's lives. Say if we take his brother-in-law, Ken, that he visits in the hospital, Norman just assumes that Ken doesn't have much of a life, really, and yet you know, he's got this woman in his life, and he's thinking about opening up his own driving instructor school. You know, that sense of possibility, which Norman is completely blind to, because he doesn't see the world in terms of possibilities, perhaps until later on in the novel, near the conclusion. So that cynicism and pessimism means that, you know, Norman doesn't look for the silver lining with anything. He doesn't look for opportunities. He's actually closed down in that regard. So I would say that was his blind spot, was his pessimism, his cynicism. With Edwin, we're looking at, in some ways, a more subtler blind spot, in that he is the dutiful one up to a point, but he is somewhat hemmed in by a sense of decorum and social propriety, and that sort of means that his altruism is not quite as authentic. It's a bit more muted, I felt, really, in that
absolutely
he does try and help Letty to get another flat, and she ends up moving in with Mrs. Pope, which is not ideal for Letty, but it was almost as though for Edwin that he wanted to do the right thing, but he didn't. It was more for himself than for Letty, which meant that he ended up making some poor choices on her behalf, I feel.
I would agree. Yeah, I mean, if I maybe just was to jump in on those two, because I think those are very good points. Yeah, just in terms of Edwin, I mean, he seems to me to be the most, to be quite an interesting combination, insofar as he, as you say, he's dutiful, and he's explicitly, religious, and so he thinks a lot about what's right and what's wrong. But he's deeply, he's kind of adopted a strange widower bachelor lifestyle. It's described basically that his wife has died, and this has given him a lot of freedom to go out and do what he really likes, which is get involved in all these kind of church social events. And there is a kind of surreal carefulness about committing to things that aren't enjoyable for him. He loves to go for drinks with Father G, as he called, his local minister, and he has this kind of abstract thoughtfulness. He definitely does. But yeah, to me, there is just there's a detachment. There was one quote I noted, which is that where they're actually in the hearse together going to Marcy's funeral, when it's and the quote is, so it's quoting Edmund. He says, "I brought Phyllis here," said Edwin in a matter-of-fact manner. "It's the nearest crematorium for where I live."
Yeah.
And then it says, Letty, momentarily embarrassed, but Edwin did not seem to be affected by the memory of his dead wife, only going on to say that they had had a service which was very well attended. So it's like, there is a kind of coldness actually to his, at times, decorum and ethical behaviour that, he just seems quite a detached man, really.
Well,
being quite
that's true. I mean, I remember that point in the novel, because how matter-of-fact he was about his wife's departure, and there's this strange blend of pragmatism and altruism in Edwin, which is probably not uncommon amongst congregations. That you will get the Edwins that their sense of duty means they're quite abstract in how they go about it, quite detached from it, and because he didn't really have much feeling or consideration for Letty, while he arranges things to help her, he doesn't do it in a very nuanced or considerate way. So while he is helping her, it is quite detached, it's quite pragmatic, it's almost like he's wanting to expend a burden by getting this sorted. He's doing it probably more for himself, to be honest, than actually for Letty, because he didn't really consider what might suit Letty. He didn't consider that maybe Mrs. Pope would have been the ideal landlord and co-tenant for her. It was all. There was almost a contemptuous disregard for Letty, almost like, well, this will do for her.
I think
it wasn't very considerate, even though he did actually fulfill a duty in a way, but a duty, as you say, in a kind of detached and way. He's a pragmatic altruist. It's a strange blend of qualities.
I think a nice little nuance that Pim puts in, which I think illustrates that, is that there's an ongoing reference to him eating jelly babies, and at the start, he would say he would always eat them at the end of lunch, and Letty would come back and he would always offer her one knowing she would never accept one, and he would kind of tuck into them. And I think there's a point later after she's gone and he's spreading out on her desk and putting his lunch there that he puts his jelly babies down and has a kind of vivid memory of her that he doesn't quite understand, and it's like, again, it was like he liked to be seen to be offering them, but he really just wanted to eat them, and she kind of knew that on some level and didn't take one. I mean, that's a very good point, that he is the kind of person that would love to offer something knowing that you would decline it, because at least he'd be seen to offer. Yes.
And so there is something quite deep about the jelly baby point, which is that this is someone that is very concerned with how he's seen to be dutiful and altruistic, but is quite reserved, as you say, quite cold in some regards, and quite detached, really.
I mean, when him and Norman, when they have the lunch with, the Letty, Marcy, after they've retired, there's the issue of paying for it, and obviously Edwin is aware he's better off than Norman, so he feels it should be up to him, but then he says, don't worry, I've had lunch vouchers, I hardly paid anything for it, so he's kind of got, it's been a cheap lunch, and he likes that, so there's a stinginess.
There is a stinginess in terms of money, and there's a stinginess in terms of how much he puts himself out. There's no... He's an altruist that would never sacrifice anything. So there's a kind of limit there.
Exactly.
There's no real sacrifice. And I'm sure that Pim was suggesting that when the lunch vouchers run out, that they might not be getting invited to lunch anymore.
Well, that's
and it's this sort of mean-spirited gestures that we see recurring in the novel. I'm reminded of Letty's first landlady, how when she has a coffee morning for the tenants to discuss their next landlord, that she uses the cheaper coffee. Because you don't want to use the more expensive coffee on that lot. So there is this sort of mean-spiritedness, and people generosity is pretty rare in this novel. In fact, it's almost like a unicorn. It doesn't exist. There's no real generosity of spirit, because as we've said, the four of them, particularly Norman, Edwin, and Marcy, are so mired in unconstructive perspectives that there's little possibility for them to be that generous. Even the gesture of Marcy leaving her home to Norman can't really just be put down to generosity. Her motives are a little bit obscure. It's not clear cut that she thought much about Norman's plight, and that's why she left it to him. Perhaps she did up to a point. But
there's also just the darker point that, there really wasn't anybody else, that was it, that there was no family. He was probably her preferred of the three at the office, although she's got an ambivalence about him. But it's not...
There was the cousin and her son. She left some money to them. So it does seem like that Marcy did think a bit about Norman's situation, but it wasn't... We know how she feels after she sees him watching her with the milk bottles, like how irate she is, and what she thinks of Norman quite sometimes. It's far from friendly. It's
like both. So I was going to say, it's like, but that's a very interesting one, that the way they both misinterpret each other at that moment, and in terms of she sees him as she calls it loitering with intent or spying, which she never considers he maybe actually would have wanted to just come and see her.
No,
and he can't also really admit that to himself. It's like he's driven by his unconscious to get a bus in the direction of her house, and he doesn't exactly know why. And again, it's like it's funny. He's kind of, his meanness, if you could call it that, is maybe slightly different from Edwin's in terms of it's like he's got this sense of being a victim of the world. It's like he's it says he's never known his mother, he's brought up by an aunt, and he's just got, it's like he's that kind of, that kind of man that's just feels very inferior and feels bitter, and so he's kind of, quite out of kilter as well with his kind of tender side, actually. So it's a strange one, that kind
well,
of,
yes,
their perspectives on each other.
Norman does feel a bit more tenderness or a bit more warmth towards Marcy than what Edwin ever did.
Yes.
But yes, as you say, he was brought up by an aunt. He probably never felt that much wanted. And for a man in the 1970s working in an office, it would have been emasculating in that way, because it would have been seen in that more patriarchal times as a woman's job. And so I think there's even some kind of reference to that element of it in the novel. Right. So, and Norman feels ineffectual, and he's very frustrated. As you say, he feels like a victim, even though the injustice is a bit more obscure that he suffered there too. But when we look at Letty, we're looking at someone that her perspective or her limitations are not as obvious as the others. It's not as though she's a stand-in for Barbara Pym, but she's probably the closest character to Barbara Pym in that she has a bit more awareness of proprieties, and also a bit more awareness of the subtleties of what's going on. But her limitation is a certain passivity. She is rather timid for most of the novel. Yes. And that does change near the end for Letty. But for much of it, she's mired in a kind of passivity of following other people. What Marjorie, for example, wants. Marjorie suggested that they live together in the retirement, and it's a bit like she is a follower in that regard. And you see that with Mrs. Pope, who's a bit insufferable, isn't she? But yes, Letty is quite timid and toes the line. But she is more aware of people's ungenerous comments or acts, and she tries to be more considerate, even if she's somewhat limited in what she does.
Sorry, yes, I agree, and I think that was a good point about that. Maybe she's the character in a way that's most kind of closest to say, Barbara Pym's own perspective, because she's the only one that I would say is maybe more lucid about her situation of being a bit isolated and actually making more genuine, realistic attempts to some extent to carve out or at least reflect on what a retired life might be. But as you said, she insofar as she acts, it's really restricted and timid and quite conventional, so it says like at one point, she's somebody who's had holidays abroad, which the others haven't had, and at one point she goes to stay with a cousin and they get on well. So there's a sense that she's sort of trying, but she is quite a tame person, and I thought it was interesting. What struck me as kind of not a fatal flaw, but the when her she's renting a room in this house, and there's new landlords take over the house, and they're evangelical Christians from Nigeria, and so obviously there's a real kind of cultural clash there, and it's like, because there's obviously kind of implicit racial prejudice kind of ripples through that as well, obviously the idea of Nigerian landlords and so on, but it's like with her that what seems to put her off the most is the idea that they're very lively and loud people, and they're depicted as actually quite warm and welcoming towards her, but it's like the liveliness is too much for her, so she then goes and moves in with this very stern, quite chilly older woman, Mrs. Pope, who's not really going to be a joyful person to really live with, but it's like the kind of she was just a bit too mired to her kind of the conventions of her upbringing that made her feel like she had to make that move. So it's not.
Well, yes, that's a very good point, that the liveliness is something that she finds off-putting, and so she makes a bad decision there to leave. I'm sure at one point she recognises that maybe it would have been best to have stayed with the Nigerian landlord, that it would have been more welcoming, it would have been warmer, actually, rather than this austere Mrs. Pope. But somebody like Letty, Letty is the only one in the novel that has the capacity for regret. The other three don't. And because she has that capacity for regret, the more lively people are around her, the more she might be aware of what she's missed out. And the more that she could regret what has happened in her life, even if she's not actually quite sure how she got from her youth to where she is currently. She's been so timid and perhaps unreflective at points in her life that she doesn't really know how she's got to this point. But she's found herself in a somewhat bewildering situation. But there is that sense of regret there, which the others don't have. She is also the only character that is, and this might be an odd way of putting it, but it is a sign of a certain strength that she has, in that she's the only character that can recognise desolation or bleakness of her circumstances at points. The other three do not see that, at least consciously. It's either that they don't have the capacity to see the bleakness, or they're so well defended against it. But Letty is aware that retirement stage of life can be desolate if you're not careful, but the other three don't see that.
I think that's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, for one thing, she kind of foresees it. You know, she's obviously had this arrangement with a friend because she was aware that this was going to be a difficult time, and then obviously, unfortunately, the timing. You know, the friend has you know, started this relationship again with this local vicar, isn't it, or local minister so that's kind of thwarted her plans. And yeah, it's like she's got that self-awareness and that foresight, and I think it's a good point as well. Yeah, she can actually, you know, regret the paths her life's taken and be a bit more. Just a bit more affected and aware of that, but at the same time, she's, you know, like it's the scene where she has lunch with the others. She, you know, they ask her how she's getting on, and she has to, you know, say, oh well, you know, the days are busy or something like that. She still feels she can't be honest about it. Actually, unfortunately, you know, there's a need to kind of keep, you know, to some extent, not expose that kind of vulnerability too much. You know,
well, yes, maybe also even to herself.
Well, yeah.
And there's probably a lack of awareness there about how it is for others, because it's not as though the other three are leading dramatic lives, fun-packed lives. If she had a bit more awareness, she would guess that they share quite a lot in common. They share some difficulties in common, but it's as if... She wants to keep that sense of propriety and social decorum continuing in her behaviour, really. What she says is to cover up those vulnerabilities.
I know that's true.
When we look at Marcy, obviously we're looking at the most eccentric of the four by a long way. And indeed, probably nowadays she would be diagnosed with OCD, you know, with this hoarding and ordering tendencies, and there's obviously a paranoia that she has too. She is someone that's suspicious and therefore quite ungenerous in her judgments of others. You know, when she notices the milk bottle that is not from the same dairy as all the others, she then recalls that's one that Letty had brought in one day and offered some milk, wasn't it, in the office?
Yes, right, yeah.
And rather than see it as a friendly thing, she sees it as a gesture to, ruin her system. You know, her systemizing of these milk bottles. And so it's that suspiciousness and that paranoia that means that she's quite ungenerous in how she sees people, and quite antagonistic too. As you say, that encounter she has with Norman when they both see each other, that she sees it as like a loitering with intent. You know, it's the most pernicious, insidious motives that she attributes to other people. But of course, Barbara Pym does not make her out to be someone deeply unpleasant either. She shows the character's vulnerabilities. Her infatuation with Mr. Strong, while it's very misguided and very much a fantasy, is still showing that there is some, romantic tendencies in Marcy. Is still some affection, if we could always put it that way. Even if it is obsessive as well. I mean, her feelings for Mr. Strong are as obsessive as the collecting of milk bottles, because she has to go and visit his house, stand across from it, have a look at it, see what his garden might be like. So there's still an obsessive quality. Not quite a stalking quality, but you never know if she'd been younger what that might have become.
Yeah. No, I agreed. Yeah, I think that sums up Marcy well. I mean, I agree. It's like, it's again a character so well written, actually, because there are these little moments. There's one point where Norman, she's about to leave the restaurant and she's not really enjoyed it. She's clearly very out the habit of socialising, having been retired for a while. But then Norman says, something like, "Oh, we're enjoying your company," or "We don't get the chance to speak," or some little kind of warmth that really resonates with her and keeps her there. But by the time she's got to the end of it and she's now thinking about this milk bottle that she's actually brought with her, she dismisses the whole lunch as a waste of time. But, she then does this very kind of disturbingly antisocial thing of following Letty and demanding she takes this milk bottle back, and then she walks away feeling like it's been worthwhile in the end, so a very kind of disturbed mindset, really.
Well, yes.
It's the kind of, it's the tragedy actually with her that the one who has, really psychologically disintegrates, when she's removed from the kind of day-to-day, I suppose, buffer of just or just the connection with others. She's also the one that's the most paranoid and hostile to others. That's that's putting herself in that isolated situation. Actually, that's affecting her sense of reality.
Well,
so
it
very
has.
kind of tragic.
It has. The ordering of the milk bottles, you feel that is a way of her trying to impose some order on her life and a sense of control, and as ineffectual or misguided as it may be. But because our focus is on things like milk bottles rather than mowing our lawn or socialising, more things that are pro-social, because mowing the lawn is also thinking about your neighbours as much as it is about oneself, and likewise socialising is thinking about others. She's on this sort of private quest to order these milk bottles and order her clothes and things like that, so obsessive, but also time consuming. I mean, that's one of the things that Barbara Pym says about Letty's first day of retirement compared to Marcy which is that Marcy kind of flies by in a way because she's so obsessive, and it's that compulsive behaviour would be no doubt a way of avoiding her fears and her pain. And I would suspect that what had happened to Marcy's mother's death and also Snowy the cat's death, that these have been traumatic for Marcy, but she's never, got in touch with that pain and worked on it, reflected on it. She rather goes on these quests to order things that have got nothing to do with that, and therefore are safe in a way. They are obsessive distractions from probably that deep-rooted pain that never gets looked at.
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, certainly the degree to which she's kind of detached herself from others, and of course the way that she always seems to perceive a reaching out so cynically, at any time like the social worker comes, or I think there's a point where Letty says, "Oh, you're looking a bit tired," and offers to make her a cup of tea, and she, at that point earlier in the novel, she kind of recognises the kindness, but she still has quite a cruel thought about, she thinks, "Oh, is it an old sheep or something?" She thinks Letty is, and there's just always a kind of cynical reading, which is strange, that given that this is quite straightforwardly people having a little bit of sympathy for her, she doesn't see it,
Yeah, it's more ungenerous than what Norman thinks of others. I mean, he is a cynic, but she is particularly suspicious, and because she's got such an unusual private life, if we can call it that, she would not want people knowing what she's up to. She would have to suspect people, if they were coming to her door, do they want to pry? Because she's doing, these odd private pursuits, which you must know on some level is a bit unusual. But in the novel, when she tries to find out where Snowy is buried in the garden, there is a sort of sense that she's maybe looking a little bit at that pain.
That's true.
But it doesn't amount to anything, because unfortunately for Marcy, it's all too late. The scene you described, where Norman encourages her to sit a little bit more when they're having lunch. I mean, she acknowledges that up to a point, but again, it's too late in terms of their circumstances for it to amount to anything. If they were still working together and they had gone to lunch together, that would have been much more consequential for their lives. That change, as small as it might be, but it's at the wrong time, and that's part of the tragedy of her circumstances, is that when anything that is a bit constructive just doesn't happen at an opportune time, or the right time for Marcy.
That was a good point as well about the respective differences actually in this transition to retirement. Letty's very frustrating day one, where she really, in a sense, feels the time weighing on her, and Marcy has been lost in this kind of obsessive, blur. I guess the third question we're going to discuss was about the issue of well, I mean, the novel maybe satirises some of the more kind of conventional cliches about retirement, but generally, this being a very hard time for people, making the transition into simply enjoying, the kind of stereotypical leisurely retirement is actually quite a hard thing for people to do, I would think. Certainly that seems to be what Pym is suggesting in the novel here. So what's your thoughts on that? Do you see it as a very difficult transition inevitably, or do you think it's not as straightforward as that?
Well, we have to bear in mind that with these four characters, that this stage of life is particularly difficult for them, because they're not retiring and then spending more time with the grandkids sort of life. No, they don't really have family, so it is much more difficult for them. There isn't that sort of safety net, or there isn't that prospect of fulfilling things that often people do at that stage of life, in terms of more time to spend with your partner, more time to spend with your grandchildren and your own kids too. They don't have that. So I don't know how, they're obviously facing a bleaker, or potentially bleaker, set of circumstances compared to many. Again, it can vary, because I've heard some people saying to me how much they were looking forward to retirement, and then when they did retire, that they've enjoyed it, whereas others might see it as a wasteland. I mean, obviously there's possibilities in between those two, of course there are. So it very much depends, but so maybe it makes more sense to look at the potential challenges of it, because some people do very much enjoy that stage of their life. One way in which it can be a challenge is that if you've derived a lot of meaning and status and esteem from your job, and you're no longer doing that, there can be, it can almost feel like a demotion for some people. Yeah. You no longer quite have the same standing or importance. And there was a drama teacher, famous drama teacher, Lajos Egri, if that's how you pronounce his name, that had written a couple of seminal books on drama, and one of the chapters in one of his books is about how important it is for us to feel important. He said it is our most basic need. And whether that's the case or not, we know that, say, in Maslow's pyramid, self-esteem, which is our sense of importance in many ways, is so integral to our well-being. And that can be reduced. It might even feel decimated by retirement. I mean, say if you were Mr. Strong, the surgeon, in this novel, when he retires, well, it looks as though he has a family and he has that kind of safety net that these four main characters, don't have. But it could be still difficult for a Mr. Strong in that he's no longer the esteemed consultant anymore. People are not asking for his advice. Nurses aren't following him, and patients aren't following him as he walks down the corridors of the hospital. And so it could be he could feel a real loss there, potentially.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's interesting. Obviously, you mentioned earlier, Norman, the character, for example, is this guy who feels very emasculated because even in his job, his working life, he doesn't really feel like he's, achieved what maybe the stereotypical male might at that certain period in time. But obviously for him, he's living in a bedsit, without the inheritance that Marcia leaves him. Actually, his retirement's would be a very bleak and frustrating prospect. Of course, the lack of family and so on as well. So that the economic circumstances, the low self-esteem combined with the lack of company would be diabolical, really. And so that, I think you're right. These characters, it's really amped up. I think Letty as well. There's the issue of because she's not married. Again, the way things were at that time, it's not been a particularly well paid job. She's looking at renting a room or at best house sharing with her friend. That's so the sort of economic circumstances are making retirement more difficult. Particularly for her. So again, limited options. So
none of them. Well, maybe Edwin, it's a little bit different, but for Letty and Norman, if Norman hadn't had the house left to him, they would not be living at their leisure, so to speak. So there is that thing of not only have they been expended by this company, and their roles are actually expendable too because they're not getting replaced, that department. So it highlights again, in a more marked form, the expendability that people could feel after they've dedicated 30, 40 years of their working lives to a company. And then, they're kind of politely shown the door.
Yeah,
and but yes, the economic situation is part of the difficulties for them in retirement. Whereas we could imagine if someone has been a noted lawyer or a noted surgeon like Mr. Strong, that he is retiring to his nice big house with his family, and so he's cushioned. He has a cushion in life, or maybe more than one cushion, which these characters don't have. So it does depend. But yes, there are natural challenges partly for everyone with retirement. One of them is facing your own mortality.
Of course, yeah.
Even if you have a good retirement, you're aware that you're in your final phase of your life. So at that stage, even good things can be bittersweet, because you know that you're in your final phase of your life. I heard that when Alfred Hitchcock won his Lifetime Achievement Oscar, that he felt like, well, that must mean I'm not far from death now. And that was true, actually.
Yep.
So even positive things can be affected by that sense that you're in your final phase of your life, and nobody's escaping that, even if you're Mr. Strong, say.
No, I think that element is key, really, isn't it? Because obviously the title of the novel, Quartet in Autumn, it's referring to the autumn of life, and there's recurring mention to leaves. I think at one point it talks about Norman, he doesn't use up his holiday time, and then it says that these unused holiday days sit there like dead leaves.
Yeah.
And then later there's Letty, I think she's having a woodland walk with her friend who's talking, at length about this new man that she's in love with, and who of course they won't live together. And it describes her seeing the beech leaves in the woods and wondering if it might be a good place to die, thinking about this idea about countryside. It's really about death, this idea of moving out into the country. So yeah, I think that's unavoidably, part of the
Well, it
difficulty as
is
well for these characters.
It is. Yeah, the Letty is actually the only one that really reflects on death. One of the interesting things about this novel is that all four of them are in the autumn years of their lives, but they don't really reflect too much on death. I mean, for Letty, it comes in with these intrusive considerations, such as what would it be like to lay down and die here in the woods, and things like that, more macabre-like thoughts. But none of them really are facing their mortality in any extensive way. And, philosophers like Heidegger would say that it's the confrontation with our mortality that allows us to be more responsible and authentic in our choices. And there's the therapist Irving Yalom that wrote a book called Staring into the Black Sun, I think it's called, which is facing our mortality. These characters are not staring into the black sun in any shape or form, really. There, in some ways, I've heard critics say that for Barbara Pym, that every day is redemptive in many ways, because making a cup of tea, having some biscuits, or making an omelette, for her, these are little redemptive things, comfort food that helps us deal with the trials and tribulations of life. But there is also the thing that the everyday, as existentialist philosophers keep on banging on about, can sort of obscure our mortality, and in obscuring it, we can get lost in the everyday and maybe lose sight of what is essential. Because even if the black sun is difficult to look at, by confronting it, we're reminded of what's most important in our lives and how our lives are finite, and we must, make good decisions for our own benefit, for our own good, as much as we can.
I think
anyway.
so. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's true, isn't it? It's interesting with the characters, aside from Letty, as you said. I'm sure early in the novel there's a mention to Norman's reading a paper and he makes some comment about hypothermia and older people, and Letty's the one that winces at that. The rest of them, it's like speaking about a slightly detached issue. And then, of course, Marcia, is starving herself, actually, as she's hoarding tins of food, and thinking, actually, that she's somehow protecting herself, so in all of them, there is a real, even when the issue's explicitly discussed, there's not an emotional investment in it, actually, what this means deeply, aside from Letty, as you described.
Well, the thing for Barbara Pym is that the characters in her novels that are closest to her in outlook, if not completely in personality, are the ones that can exercise a certain novelistic empathy with other people. And Letty in that scene is demonstrating that. She can imagine, what it must be like to be in that situation, how it's a situation that she may unfortunately have to confront if she's not too careful. So she has that, and she also at points would think about Marcy facing a situation that she's facing. This is something that Barbara Pym's protagonists often do, is that they wonder how other people in their lives would face certain circumstances or what their lives may be like. So it's a sort of novelistic empathy that Letty has. The others don't really have that. They're, as we've said, they're a bit too mired in their own perspectives. And maybe also somewhat self-satisfied, but for wrong reasons. There's a certain pride that the others have, a misguided pride in their own judgments and outlook.
I think you're right. I mean, like both, we mentioned the economic situation a little while ago, and obviously, both Marcy and Edwin, they're kind of financially comfortable, aren't they? And there's a slight sense of, awareness of that. I think Marcia has a kind of slight, she slightly looks down on Norman actually, because he's a slightly, in this sense of inferior status. And I thought it was interesting that both of those two actually repeatedly, consider the prospect of letting one of the others house share with them. Marcia, at some point Edwin, he's aware that he has a house and Norman lives in a bedsit and he has a spare room, and then there's talk about could Letty and Marcy have shared, and again, those with the kind of, the power to do that really shy away from it. They don't want to be bothered.
Well, that goes back to the responsibility issue that we were talking about earlier on. Again, this novel is complex, and while we could see that Marcia could have Letty stay with her and Edwin can with Norman too, it isn't unfortunately straightforward in that Norman might not be the easiest person to live with, for one thing, given how he is. So it's a bit complex, but what I think Pym was at least saying is that Marcy and Edwin should have reflected on it more deeply than what they did, even if they decided against it, ultimately. But they did not engage in any real moral inquiry. And I think that's what Barbara Pym was asking of the characters, really.
Indeed, I think that's a very that's a very apt way of putting it, actually. It links in actually to another question we can consider that really on that issue, because I think there are there's various moments where characters do read each other quite astutely, actually. You can see that, but at the same time they have this tendency to just kind of accept their own flattering, usually self-justifications, maybe particularly when they've evaded a responsibility, of course, but other times as well. And I think this comes up so much. It's like, to me, it seemed like Pym was trying to depict this as almost a kind of universal habit that we have. So I was curious to get, do you think, is that the case? And if so, why is this something we're so prone to do?
Well, we know that self-deception is ubiquitous. We all engage in it to some extent, and we see that process with each of these characters. Maybe not so much Letty, but with the other three, particularly Edwin and Marcia, that are, as you say, economically privileged compared to the other two. And so they've got more that they would want to hide. They want to not confront perhaps their obligations, or at least their obligation to morally reflect. So self-deception is ubiquitous. We all do it because there's things that make us feel uncomfortable, and we always have the capacity to at least temporarily shove them away. The thing about it is that one of the most compelling accounts of self-deception that I've read is by the philosopher Herbert Fingery. I think you've read it as well, his book on self-deception.
Yeah. Oh, that's right,
And he kind of uses a Sartrean, related to John Paul Sartre, Sartrean view of self-deception. But basically, in relation to what we're talking about here, is that he says that self-deception is knowing something which he says is on a pre-reflective level. In other words, an unarticulated level, but not putting it into words, not avowing it. And so we can have a sense of a discomforting truth that we don't want to spell out to ourselves, because if we put it into words, we become more conscious of it, and we also become more committed to confronting it when we can't just leave it at the unarticulated level and push it away. And this is the thing, there is a connection between authentic avowal of our situation and moral courage. In Freud's first book, Studies in Hysteria, he actually says that people would not repress if they had more moral courage. So he sees it as a lack of that virtue. Self-deception is lacking moral courage, according to Freud. And we can see that with these characters, that if they had more moral courage, they would reflect upon these uneasy and situations that they're in and potential moral obligations that they might have to confront. If they had that moral courage, they would look at those things, but they don't. It's so easy to shove it away, to not think about it, not to articulate it to yourself.
Yes, it's like a sort of, like maybe like a kind of Pandora's box effect, because it struck me that obviously what they're doing is protecting their own self-image in their own minds, by not, by avoiding spelling out these things or just giving a slightly flattering, touch up to something. But obviously then, if somebody's operating from quite a simplistic view of human nature, maybe quite an unreflective one, including of their own nature, people kind of can fall into either good or bad categories in a kind of clear-cut way. And so obviously as soon as people start to maybe own selfish thoughts, and really own that, then it kind of raises the question of which camp they'd be in, actually, the good camp or the bad camp. So yeah, I kind of wondered maybe there is a sort of I think you could say moral laziness there, or just a tendency to kind of try and stick with a more straightforward positive self-image, actually, that could be just kind of shoving such ambiguities down into the unconscious a little bit when, as you described, maybe we do get a sense of them, but there's a discomfort that we kind of then shy away from a little bit.
Well, yes. I mean, if we look at Edwin, for example, here is a man that can feel he's a good person if he does his duty, if he follows certain ritualistic, acts.
Yes.
The church provides a context where he can feel like a good person if he attends church, if he donates things to the local church, if he helps Letty to get another room. These sort of things allow him to feel that he's a good person. But that is obviously a somewhat self-justifying outlook, because it obscures or overlooks the role of motive, of intention, and what you're feeling inside. And to open yourself up to that is to look at the fact that we're much more complex than that. And it's easier just to believe that if you do these kind of pragmatically altruistic acts as he does, that makes you a good person. If he was looking at his own motives, scrutinising them more, and his own feelings, he would realise, like any other person, that he's a more ambivalent creature. Yeah. And that's the thing about opening ourselves up to how we really are, having that moral courage, is that we see a multitude of thoughts and feelings and potential motivations, and it's harder to define ourselves as simply good or bad. But of course, we've got more the chance of growth if we're being honest with ourselves. That's the upside of not exercising self-deception.
I think so. Well, exactly, yeah, because I mean, the sort of flip side, I guess, to the convenience of just deceiving yourself about your motivation, say, as you described in the way that Edwin might be doing. What will linger, of course, is a kind of looming but unarticulated sense of, almost like an unconscious sense that maybe you might be worse than you actually are. If there's no owning of the bad or the selfish, then it's so there could actually be a kind of inverse effect on, say, the kind of self-esteem the characters have that might actually in some ways lead them to devalue their own worth on some level. Like, for example, Marcia doesn't consider Norman might like her, or there might be something likable about her that, he's coming over to spy. It's not something, again, that's such a kind of actually negative implied view of herself, actually, that's going on.
Well, yes, if we're opening ourselves up to possibilities of how things are, then we have to deal with potential cognitive dissonance between how we thought they are and how they seem to be, and that can be painful for some people. The thing about paranoia and suspicion and skepticism is that they can be very protective. Marcy is somewhat protected by these perspectives, even if they're stultifying and life-denying. They do protect her in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, somebody could be in an air raid shelter, protected from harm, but there's not much fulfillment in that situation. And her perspectives are a bit like that air raid shelter, that they protect her, but it's like a tomb, a crypt, really. It rules out any positive motivation from others, really, there. And
well, exactly.
And I think when we look at self-deception as well, I was just thinking about a book written by an existential psychologist and therapist, Robert Firestone, called The Fantasy Bond. And his view is that many people have a fantasy bond, which is this imagined connection with someone. It doesn't need to be like Marcy with Mr. Strong, but that is certainly a very good example of a fantasy bond. And he felt it actually precluded us from living fully and living authentically, because these fantasy bonds, like she has with Mr. Strong, they give her some attachment and meaning in her life, as illusory as it is. But if she actually was to lose that fantasy bond and face up authentically to the bleakness of her situation, then there could potentially be some change there. But she lives in this self-deceiving state where she has this connection, this bond with Mr. Strong that doesn't really exist. It is almost a complete fantasy, but it is her main attachment in her life.
The ending of the novel, I thought was kind of interesting. It obviously ends on, somewhat of a understatedly hopeful note. Typical Barbara Pym, it would have to be understated. So I guess the question really was, what are the potential prospects for these characters to have happy, maybe, or at least less isolated retirements? So I don't know, maybe I could kind of, give you, my kind of take first for that one. I mean, I thought it was kind of, there was a kind of poignant irony, really, I thought, to me, that the most antisocial character, really, you could say, in the novel, or at least the most isolated one, has done this grand gesture, obviously, in leaving her house to Norman, which her death and they're getting together to organise the funeral and so on is almost like a potential catalyst for the others to actually maybe get over that awkward bridge from colleagues to being friends, perhaps. So, I'm not, it wasn't, it certainly, it was far from a happy ending or even a terribly positive ending, but I thought, there was maybe signs there, and obviously there's a kind of slightly, the final page, the ideas that Letty's friend Marjorie in the countryside, who's now, been dumped by the vicar and is now suddenly eligible, is encouraging Marjorie to bring Norman and Edwin out on a day in the countryside, this idea. But it kind of ends with a sort of, humorous line from Letty in a way that she, something, that suddenly she was aware the future had more possibilities. It's not that she thinks they're all about to become, two couples and live in the countryside, But, it was like, it was enough in a way to slightly, give her a sense of possibility that she wasn't seeing. So I thought there was a sort of, a kind of moderate but, somewhat upbeat finale going on there. It wasn't like I just have, an out-and-out bleak prognosis. What did you think?
Well, there's a number of things I thought about. I agree with what you're saying, that there was a more possibility for these characters, and that's probably to do with the fact that the death of the most eccentric and antisocial member probably allowed those three to be closer, actually, because one of the interesting things about their choices is that when they have that lunch in the rendezvous, that get together, they have the four of them together, which is, I suppose, the right thing to do, but it doesn't occur to Edwin and Norman that they might just invite Letty, and that Marcy is too difficult a person to relate to and leave her out. I'm not saying that would be the right thing to do, but because Marcy was included and Marcy is so eccentric, it makes the get-together more complicated, and perhaps some people, might think that what was the point, really? You know, like she comes after Letty with the milk bottle and thrusts her at her and then walks away. I mean, if it was me, I'd be thinking, I don't want to meet this person again.
The other somebody asks her, "What have you been doing with your retirement?" And she says, "That's my business."
Yes,
she cuts them dead.
Exactly. So she is quite antisocial, to say the least. But because she's died, and it's brought the three closer together, you know, because they've now got more of an awareness of the finitude of their lives and also what they've had in common, that they could be there for each other in a way, up to a point. There is that, to a point. That's what makes it a bit more hopeful, obviously in an understated way. So that there is that potential for them to recognise the importance of being there for each other, because they're all that each other has in a way. And with Marcy not being there, it's probably going to make it easier for them to socialise, actually, with each other, because Marcy did make it more complex, to say the least.
I think that is a good point. It was like she occupied their thoughts in a kind of guilty way, but in a way that demotivated them to, you know, Norman and Edwin particularly, to actually take any action to instigate something. It was like a kind of hot potato kind of situation.
Well, exactly. And out of social decorum and a little bit of concern as well, if they were meeting in the future and Marcy was still alive, she'd always have to be brought along, and that would just make them disinclined to do it. Whereas now they could come occasionally to the country and see Letty, and they could. There's a chance of more of a friendship. It was like a certain alignment of circumstances. You know, obviously Norman has been left this house by Marcia, so he, you know, obviously mentioned, you know, enhanced maybe self-esteem, but you know, economic means. Edwin, it's hard to imagine him changing much about his kind of, you know, bachelor church-going lifestyle, because he seems so deeply invested in that. But I mean, he does have that part of him that wants to do the right thing to a point and meeting up. So you could see that a little bit more. Yeah, but I would say that because Edwin and Norman hadn't quite faced retirement like Letty had, that when they do, they probably would rely on each other more for company, because they are what each other has, really. I'm sure that Edwin... They should. I know that Edwin would be involved with the church quite a lot, but still he would probably recognise that meeting up with Letty and Norman was some company, and that they did share this commonality, even if it wasn't something that they originally wanted or they had recognised before Marcy's death. But the second thing that I wanted to say regarding it is that I did find the end of the novel a bit curious, because I don't have it right beside me, but I think probably the last line said something about a recognition of the infinite possibilities of change. You know, that life had the infinite possibilities of change. I think
that's exactly what it is, yeah.
And I thought to myself, is this a misstep from Barbara Pym? Because this is an immaculate novel in so many ways. We know how subtle and humorous it is. But that last line, it just doesn't gel with the rest of the novel, I feel. I feel it was a misstep to put it that way. Maybe it was what she deeply believed, but I'm not sure that the characters prove that, to be honest.
No, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about that word. Infinite possibilities for change just seems so contradictory. It's funny. It just
seems like an unwarranted upbeat sentiment, or a philosophy of life that the novel doesn't justify.
It's funny, really, because the first line of the novel is, that day the four of them went to the library, though at different times, you know, which just absolutely sets up perfectly, you know, what we see, you know, this connection. So I think you're right, to go almost full circle to such a infinite change. No, I think and it's not even really implied in the scene that's just happened, actually, you know, in terms of the the sort of somewhat reconciliation with a friend in the countryside, because Letty still, has got now a more guarded view of this friend. She seems less inclined to be led by her, actually, because it's having been ditched and then maybe tried to be picked up again. So, I think so. I think that's...
The thing is that, I felt quite saddened by it, because she had portrayed so well that even in these bleak circumstances that the characters are in, there is still the possibility for some change, some significant change, even if it is by no means very dramatic. But to say infinite change, I mean, I know I'm being pernickety here, but the fact that she wanted to put that at the end of her novel was, to my mind, that she wanted to convey something very important about how she saw life. And that's fine if she saw life that way, but she did not write a novel that conveyed that. And
it's bizarre,
actually, because it seems so unwarranted. It seems like that she wanted to be more upbeat and optimistic than what she had been practically for the whole novel. And I mean, let's face it, even if you're in more enviable circumstances than these four characters at retirement age, you're in your autumn years. It's not a thing of infinite possibility. I mean, that doesn't exist even for a young person. No. I mean, we could have the sense of infinite possibility, but quite frankly, it would be a delusion. And for her, so it doesn't really make much philosophical sense, and it doesn't really fit in with the logic of the novel. So I'm very intrigued by why Miss Pym was so careful about how she, in the way that she writes. She is a precise writer. Why she put that, it just doesn't seem warranted.
It's almost like, an editor's got in there and just done a slight reworking, you're right, it's so discordant, because everything else, as you say, our use of language, it's so carefully crafted, and the characters, are so consistent, and, it really is a beautifully written novel. But yeah, you're right, I hadn't considered that, but I agree with you, that is an odd way to...
I had to read it several times. I thought, did she write that? And I mean, I'm not going to be one of those nasty critics that says, like a decadent poet, that just spoils everything. Like one of those tiresome seats that just say, oh, well, that spoiled the whole novel. But I'm not meaning that at all. I'm just so intrigued that she wanted to write that sentiment, because, first of all, it's more a bumper sticker sentiment, I'm afraid. And secondly, she certainly didn't write a novel that supports that view of life. I remember in a speech that Pinter gave, to Bristol University about his plays, that he said that plays of the past had often portrayed life with a capital L, and he was intimating that he was portraying life with a small l. And that's what Barbara Pym does brilliantly, life with a small L. Yeah, that's not life with infinite possibilities, with a small L.
No. Yeah, and it's like, you couldn't cut another sentence out the novel really without something being lost. But yeah, you're quite right. It is a little bit, funny that the final sentence just doesn't quite fit. It really, there's no getting away from it. If she'd conveyed that. I think actually, in a way, I didn't read it carefully, and I just almost filled in, my own imaginings of what it would have said, which being that, Letty realises there's a little bit more possibility opened up to her than she might have thought there had been. A very kind of, you could make a very modest claim for a kind of positive ending, which I was kind of, obviously doing there. But yeah, you're right. I don't know. It's far out. That
it is. I mean, if she had. If she'd written something to the effect that significant changes are still possible in our lives, even if we didn't imagine they were possible, then something to that effect. Obviously, it'd have to be put in a more literary way, because that sounds like Reggie's brother-in-law kind of statement. But if for people that have seen The Fallen Rise of Rachel Perrin, they'll know what we're talking about.
They'll get that.
But if you haven't, you'll just be confused. But it was a misstep in a novel that is so precise, so exact, and who knows? It may be the case that for Barbara Pym, this was written just a few years before she herself died. That maybe it was something that she wanted to affirm to herself. Maybe there was a little bit of self-deception crept in there.
I'm not sure if you know this. I just read earlier that apparently she, because obviously in the novel Marcy has a mastectomy. She's had a breast cancer, and then it becomes terminal. Pym herself had that operation and survived for a period of time, but then obviously I think it was breast cancer. It kind of made a resurgence, and she was only, I think, was it 65 or 66? I think, when not particularly.
She was about 67. Yeah, she had succumbed to breast cancer, unfortunately, and her career, Quartet and Autumn had been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Unfortunately, it didn't win, but it was shortlisted for that. Her next novel, The Sweet Dove Died, which I've read, is a brilliant novel too. In some ways, it is as bleak as Quartet and Autumn, but yes, it might be for Miss Pym that she'd had this period where she had her wilderness years, where publishers weren't touching her books, and she still, valiantly continued to write, which was brilliant, and she did have eventually her second coming with those books. But it might be that after those wilderness years and then getting published and getting critically acclaimed again, maybe she had this sense of infinite possibility.
So that's an interesting point.
I would say that as great as that was for her and for us as well, because we were treated to these great novels, still I think it is a bumper sticker sentiment.
Indeed.
And
there's no getting it, and it's obviously it's a final point in a way we're making. Well, there's no getting around it. It's the final sentence, isn't it?
But it's the final point of what we've been talking about, but it is not the concluded point.
Indeed.
And such, because we do want to emphasise how great and moving and subtle and how intensely moralistic it is, because it looks at the morality of everyday acts, which is so important, and she's brilliant at that. So I'm not wanting to conclude on that misjudgment. I'm just saying I want to highlight it there. I just wanted to explore why that might have happened, because Barbara Pym was far too subtle and perceptive for bumper sticker sentiments in general. But something, and I'm just so intrigued why an editor didn't spot that and think, wait a minute, is this something that needs to be changed, or at least have a discussion with her about that? Because,
well, as I said, my best theory is that the editor has inserted the word infinite, where it said limited, and that's the. But no, I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? It's hard to come up with anything.
Well, she was not writing a traditional romantic story that had to have a terribly happy ending, so there was no need to fudge it in that way. I suspect, though, that's what she believed. She was probably elated by a recent good fortune, good fortune that was deserved, but it was a bit of a misstep, and and we just wanted to say to our listeners that we don't feel that it encapsulates the outlook of the novel, and dare I say, of life either, really. And
that's
stuff,
right.
we'd probably get more listeners if we were saying things like life is a great infinite possibility of change, because you know, that
who doesn't want to hear that?
who
Yeah,
doesn't want to
exactly.
hear that or believe that? But again, we
Yep.
spoke about the power of self-deception, and
Yes.
you know, there aren't infinite possibilities in life, but that doesn't mean to say that we've got to be Schopenhauerian about it as well.
Exactly. No, and I think that's what's great about Barbara Pym's writing is just the fact that it's just incredibly true to life, and she that's why, you know, she is a brilliant novelist, and her novels are so compelling for that reason. And she generally doesn't err on the, you know, unconvincingly bleak or optimistic. Actually, it just seems very much on the nose, you know, for.
Yes, but I mean,
life as it's lived with a small.
Yes,
you know,
exactly. She is a brilliant portrayer of life with a small L, which is the life that we generally all lead.
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
Not everyone, but most of us, and she shows that there is the capacity for change. There's the capacity for humour. There's the capacity for poignancy in that life. There's even the capacity for tragedy in that life. Because let's face it, Marcy is not a Greek tragic hero. But there is a tragedy there that happens in her life. And so there's something very moving and beautiful about that. And we're not just saying this so that we don't get death threats from ardent Barbara Pym fans. That was one of my motivations, but
so good qualification.
I think so. But no, that's what we're really being, and that's what we should have as our concluding statement. There is the fear that we're so worried that we haven't really smoothed it over that we go on for another 3 hours on this issue. I think probably we'll lose a lot of listeners by that point, and we'll get even less subscribers. You know, we'll be down to 0 subscribers again.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that's, you know, done justice to it. We're going to leave it in finite possibilities, not infinite. End of.
I must admit that if you use the word finite possibilities, it does sound more like a philosophy masterwork than a novel, but.
It's definitely got less of a ring to it.
It's not so literary to speak
it's,
about life has got finite possibilities, but even if it is accurate. So I'm just,
so there we
I'm
go.
looking for a rewording of that anyway.
Exactly. And well, that can be our task for the next month. We'll rewrite the final
Yes,
sentence.
that's right. Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, thank you. That's been interesting, Alex. And
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for that.
Thank
Cheers.
you.